Former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Mike Gableman joining us now. So I appreciate you being here. And I know you haven't done any TV interviews on this. So I'm really interested to hear on what this investigation is exactly that you're overseeing. I mean, what will you be doing on a daily basis?
That's as good a question as it is important. And before I get into sort of the details about it, I want to tell you the context that informs especially my interest in doing an open, fair, honest, rigorous investigation. And that has to do with the fundamental nature of what kind of government we have. We have a Republican form of democracy, so a democracy. And there's nothing more important in a democracy that the people have faith and confidence that their vote counts. Every vote counts. So this mission that I have undertaken, and when I say open, I don't mean open in the sense that I'm going to be advertising what I'm doing. I'm saying open to any and all ideas and any and all avenues that will allow me to get to the truth. I think often, and this is going a little far afield, but I promise to come back. When I accepted this job offer from the Speaker about a month ago, one of the things that immediately ran through my mind are people like my 94-year-old dad, Norb Gableman, who when he was 17, his parents were deaf and mute factory workers here in West Allis during the Depression. And at 17, my dad got in the Army and he went on a boat over to Germany. Now, he got there, I like to say Hitler heard that Norb Gableman was coming, so he surrendered. But I think of all the guys who died and who got maimed and terribly injured. And if I'm them, if I'm one of those young people, I'm telling myself, say I'm the first wave out of the landing craft on D-Day. I know that there's a very strong probability, it is likely I will be killed. But my comfort is that through my sacrifice, I will ensure the continuation of the American experiment, which is the most substantial experiment that in the history of the world that we know about, into genuine democracy where things are not run by the rich and powerful. And the rich and powerful, they have enough voices to get through to their government leaders. I've been an elected official for over 20 years. I'm familiar with how the process works. The rich and powerful do not need any more assurance that their voices will be heard. It's the common average person who their voice in our democracy is their vote. Getting back to the heart of your question, 2 days before the November 2020 election, a poll was taken across the country. And it was, I don't remember the firm that did it, but it didn't have a dog in the race. It's a truly independent, not some who claim they're independent and have a partisan interest. And that poll, 2 days before the election on November 1, 2020, told us that of all registered voters across the country, about 2/3 had doubts about whether their vote was going to count. Both parties, Democrats and Republicans, 2/3. Another thing that motivates me is, like just about every other voter, before I began this process 28 days ago, I frankly had no idea what happened to my paper ballot once I put it in the machine at my polling place on Election Day. And I remember thinking on Election Day, as I have in many election days past, that I'm putting my paper ballot, I'm putting my trust in the system, and really I'm left with sort of the rather thin comfort of hoping for the best. And right now, with the 2/3, that number changed 2 days after the election. And unsurprisingly, the people who backed President Biden, those numbers changed, so that a significant percentage 2 days after the election had more confidence. Well, also unsurprisingly, the numbers for the Republicans stayed the same. But that doesn't answer the questions that have been raised. It doesn't answer the questions about the fairness and transparency and the consistent application of the rules and laws that the people have passed through their legislators to govern elections.
So what will you be doing in the investigation? That's the question.
What I will be doing is looking at the November 2020 election and determine what went right and determine whether anything went wrong, all with an eye toward heading off the similar lack of confidence reflected in that nationwide poll of registered Republican and Democrat voters 2 days before the election, so that when we get to 2 days before the next election in 2022, that 2/3 of our fellow citizens are not walking into the polling place with serious doubts about whether their vote is going to count. And in order to effectuate that, I've already been talking to a number of people across the state. I have been doing research into legal issues. There are 3 general issues that have been publicly reported, and they are concerns about guidance documents that were issued by the Wisconsin Elections Commission, WEC. People refer to it as WEC. So WEC was an entity that was set up by the legislature in 2015 to provide guidance and assistance to our 1,852 municipal clerks across the state. And what's significant about that, from the legal issue perspective, is that the United States Constitution expressly, specifically identifies the state legislatures as the body responsible for overseeing the procedures to ensure fairness in statewide elections. Now, our Wisconsin legislature, like a lot of legislatures across the country, chose to delegate that by law, by statute, to the 1,852 clerks, who are assigned legal responsibility and authority to conduct on a local level, to identify the proper procedures, the legal procedures for how to ensure a fair, honest, and transparent election. Now, WEC was set up in about 2015 to help. Many of these clerks, many of the 1,852 are very part-time people. I'm familiar with the blessing that I have had of working in our northern part of the state, in some of our more rural communities. I'm very familiar with the concept of the local clerk who's, has not had a lot of formal training, but has had a lot of real world experience. And usually it's she, works out of her home, and she knows if her neighbor Joe hasn't voted yet. So she might say something to Joe at church. Well, that person needs help when it comes to making sure that she's following the law and doing things right. Now, WEC was set up to help, but there have been a lot of concerns publicly registered that WEC, the Wisconsin Elections Commission, which is unelected, has actually become the de facto rulers of our Wisconsin election. And the significance of that is that takes the ability of the lawful overseers of the elections, that is the clerks. And so if the clerk views the law differently based on her experience, often of many decades, where there have been no problems, she is perfectly capable of conducting, but when she gets, they call it guidance, but in reality it's taken as law by WEC. In reality, that's what the initial indications show. And there were a number of things, we're all familiar with them. The red ink issue, where the very strict procedures set out by the legislature for absentee voting. Now, absentee voting is something that I'm going to ask our viewers to really keep in the back of their minds, because, well, voting in the sense that most of us think of when I say the word let's go vote, or the phrase let's go vote, we think of Election Day, we think of going to our local polling place. Mine happens to be a Lutheran church in New Berlin. And I go there, and they've got coffee and very nice people there who are running it. But absentee voting done for convenience, done for the people who may live part-time in Florida or Arizona or have other things to do, that expansion, the legislature tells us in the preamble to the statutes, absentee voting is not a right, it is a privilege. And in order to exercise that right, that people have to follow a very specific series of rules and regulations, or the law is, if those rules are violated on a ballot, that ballot shall not be counted. And so that's one body of issue.
What will you be doing in this investigation? Is this looking at voting machines? Is this looking at the laws again? Is this interviewing people? What will you be doing in the investigation?
Thank you for bringing it back to that. Now, the first body that I mentioned, the first body of issues relate to legal issues. So interviewing will be secondary. And then the second set of questions relate to private funding of administration of public elections. Now that may be a little more fact intensive to find out who precisely was running the elections, where the private, and I'm talking about the Facebook money, the Mark Zuckerberg and Mrs. Zuckerberg or Mrs. Chan, his wife, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, owners of Facebook, set out about $350 million across the country, of which 5 of our cities here in the state got the bulk of somewhere between 8 and 10 million. I've been hearing different things. So that implicates legal research about what precisely the interplay between municipal clerks and outside money, private interest money, and people, staff, who are paid not by the people, but by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife. That's legal and factual issues.
Voting equipment, are you looking at that at all?
And the third body of issues is very centralized, and that is the machines. As I mentioned at the top of our interview, like most voters, when I walk in, I put my paper ballot in, I don't know what happens to it, and I'm left with hoping for the best. What I need to do is take a very hard look at how precisely those machines are supposed to work. And then I anticipate having serious conversations, in-depth substantial conversations with the people on the ground who use those machines and use them to report their official totals to WEC in Madison, which then put out the official state results, and find out, did those machines work as they should? And then there's been a lot of heat generated by places like in Arizona, where they're doing what they call a forensic audit.
Will yours be like that?
Well, maybe and maybe not, because I've seen a lot of heat generated by what is going on in Arizona. At this point, I am not seeing a lot of light to indicate that anything like what is happening in Arizona with what they're calling a forensic audit. And the reason I say that, kind of in quotation marks, and this is another very important point for our viewers, there is no commonly accepted definition of the term forensic audit. Forensic, that caused me a lot of confusion when I started researching. I wanted to know, of course, I want to know what is this forensic audit? How is it implemented? How could we do it in Wisconsin in a way that's responsible to the taxpayers and also to avoid kind of the confusion that may be generated by such a process? And that's when I learned there is no, so when you hear people say phrases, and you hear them too often on the news, not at this station, of course, but at some of your colleagues on the air, they'll say terms like full forensic or comprehensive forensic
Well,
audit.
not just the news. I mean, Representative Janelle Brandtjen has said voters make it clear that they want a thorough cyber forensic examination. So she's saying that, and she thinks it needs to go a step further than what you're doing.
And I may wind up agreeing with Chairman, and I did check with her, and it's Chairman Brandtjen is her preferred title. That may be, but we're going to take it step by step. We're going to do it in a logical fashion. We're going to do it based on evidence. I'm very much approaching, well, it's been over 20 years for me as a prosecutor and a judge. of one form or another. I'm very much approaching this from a legal standpoint, so that everything I do, now while the investigation is live, it's going to be extremely confidential. But at the end, there will be a full report of everything I did. And I need to make sure that every step I take is explainable to every citizen in this state, so they can understand, just like when I was writing decisions and opinions in Madison for 10 years, I want, even if they disagreed with me, they could at least know what I did and why I did it.
And when do you want to have that done by?
Frankly, my goal is by the contract I signed in June. I think, and I think I consider that a little preliminary. The contract I signed in June, before I think before anyone concerned really had a full idea of all of the issues, called for the end of October. We'll see.
I want to talk about the integrity of this investigation. You're saying you want everyone to know everything that you've done. It's been widely reported that on November 7th at a pro-Trump rally, you said, "I don't think anyone here can think of anything more systematically unjust than a stolen election." How do you convince people that you're not prejudging this, that it's a stolen election?
No, I didn't say it was a stolen election. I stand by every word that you just, I cannot, and I defy you to think of anything more unjust than a corrupt or unlawful election in a democracy. Whether that occurred here is very much a question to be examined.
So you're saying you weren't saying that after the election at a pro-Trump rally because you believed it was a stolen election?
I try to be very careful about my words. Obviously, most of the attendees there had a very particular viewpoint. I had the benefit, let me tell you what helped inform this, a very personal story. I volunteered, and I volunteered. Nobody paid me. Nobody reimbursed me for any costs. I was purely there on my own time, at my own expense. I spent over 24 hours at the Central Milwaukee Ballot Processing Center. It was a vast, I would say something like a 3,000 to 5,000 square foot open room. It was the entire floor of an abandoned office building in downtown Milwaukee. And I got there early. I had never observed a ballot process like anything. I hadn't. And so it was very much an education for me. I was taken aback because here I am with my experience in the courts of over 2 decades. I am somewhat familiar, at that time, I was somewhat familiar with the basic laws and rules concerning what election observers were allowed to do. And I got there, and within an hour, I noticed that it seemed to me anyway that the people who were running that place were not following the rules. And what I mean by that is, for example, I was trying to observe the people processing the ballot, counting the absentee ballots, and there's a very specific way they're supposed to do it. And an observer is not only allowed, but that's the whole purpose of having an observer there, is to see whether the rules are going to be followed. And to that end, the guidance that has been issued has been the observers may stand approximately 6 feet away from the table. So that allows the volunteers at the table, I don't know if they're paid, I assume they're volunteers, but the workers at the table who are counting, that gives them a little bit of elbow room so nobody's standing directly over their shoulder, but it also gives you, the observer, sort of an even shot at having a meaningful view of what's happening. Now, I noticed they were keeping me and my fellow observers about 12 feet away or so. It was way over the 6. In some cases, it was 40 feet away. I simply said to one of the guys, who I don't know his identity right now, I don't know, but I'm curious. He came up to me. I merely asked, I said, gee, I think the law, and I'm trying to be sensitive here because it's a high pressure situation for everyone. I believe the vast majority, as with the vast majority of the 1,852 clerks, The vast, vast majority of the people who volunteer their services or get paid a minimal amount to process these ballots, their hearts are in the right place. They want honesty, they want integrity, they want to do the right thing. I merely asked, I said, gee, I think the law says that I'm allowed to be about 6 feet away. And in response, one of the intermediary supervisors, bigger than I am, younger, stronger than I am, so I'm looking up. He charges me, and he starts telling me that I'm causing a disruption and that he's going to call the police. And he winds up, and I say, I'm merely asking a question. I'm not about to back down from this because this is important. And I say, I am merely asking whether the law is being followed here, sir. And I have, as an observer, as a citizen, I did not identify myself. I might have had, I had the observer name tag on, as is required by the laws, and it might have said Mike. I don't remember if it said Mike or Mike Gableman, but something like that. And then he calls the clerk over, the lady who's running the whole thing. And she says to me, well, why don't you go out and take a break for about an hour? Because I repeat it, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anybody. I merely asked. And her solution was that I had to take a 1-hour break from that processing center somewhere outside and then come back so that, as she said, everybody could cool down. Now, I want the greater good, and I don't want to escalate the situation. I don't want trouble, so I agreed to it. But I thought to myself, if I'm put in that position, that merely asking a question about the law, think about that. That all of a sudden becomes disorderly conduct and a criminal matter for the police in the eyes of this, at least this one administrator who is responsible for a region or a section of the processing center. That really, yes, that did raise doubts in my mind about whether all the rules were and all the laws were being followed.
You said Speaker Vos was going to release something today, so I want to go ahead as though, you know, on looking back.
2 days ago, right.
Yeah, what just came out from the Speaker's office
I am
then?
very heartened that 2 days ago, just this past Friday, Speaker Vos released a press release, a statement to the public, really sort of indicating that, yes, there was some general confusion at the beginning about who precisely is running this investigation, but his press release, he kindly clarified something that I kind of took as true from the beginning, but I'm not sure everybody was on the same page. I will be running this investigation.
You don't feel any pressure from Speaker Vos or fellow conservatives to find something here?
You know, in fact, that's a question that someone very high up in the elected realm of the legislature, that's all I'll say. He asked me about something, and he said, gee, won't that raise a question about who's running the investigation? And I said, if the legislature gives me the tools I need, there will be no question about who's running this investigation. I'm not in it. I'm not running for anything. I don't need money. I'm not in it for money. I have dedicated my career. I have dedicated every ounce of my professional life to the service of the people of this state. I believe that. I believe in that kind of thing. Others don't have it, but I couldn't motivate myself to work for anything really other than what I view as the public good. This is one more step, and frankly, every experience of my life, good and bad, every encounter I've had, both seeking during the electoral process and afterwards being the subject of administrative hearings about an ad that I ran 12 years ago, that has taught me, just like when I was a very young prosecutor starting out in Wausau. And at that time, there were some judges on the bench who just should not have been on the bench. And they're gone now, which is good for everybody. And I would sit there and I would watch them conduct themselves in court. And I would say to myself, Gableman, if you ever get to be a judge, don't act like that. because I also saw very good judges, and I learned from them. So every experience of my life has taught me to look at everything from very different perspectives. I can identify with pretty much everyone here. And you ask me who's going to run it, or does it have the appearance of impartiality? My response is twofold. The very important question that my mission is to ensure everybody that not only is our election system in this state factually honest, it also shall have the appearance of honesty in order to maintain the confidence of the average person whose sole means of affecting change in our society. They're not well connected enough to go to a fundraiser. They're not well connected enough to pick up the phone and call a leader, but they can vote. They can vote. And that's what the future of this country, the larger question is, I view it in this whole matter. I think the question has been fairly raised. Now it must be joined. I am joining it. And my duty is to answer the question, is the American experiment over? If our votes don't count, the American experiment is concluded and it failed. If our votes count, and if I can make some small contribution so that 2 days before the next election, we do not have 2/3 of the voters of this country having serious doubts about the honesty and integrity and whether their votes count. This is the second part of my response to your question. Don't judge me on what I'm saying, and never judge anybody on what they say they're going to do. You judge them on what they do. And when this investigation is concluded, I will either succeed or die trying to show everyone that this was an honest, rigorous, thorough investigation for all of the citizens of this state.
So Speaker Vos also told us on this show that the investigation is not meant to overturn the election results. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. My mission is just as what I've said. My mission is to try to do whatever I can so that going forward, people can have confidence that their vote counts. And part of my frustration, part of the reason I may appear to be frustrated today is because I've spent the last 28 days getting, just as in your business, all sorts of unsolicited advice and demands for immediate action. What I've been trying to formulate is a logical, step-by-step, responsible, and prudent way to go about the end point, accomplishing the mission, which is to ensure everybody so that we don't have those same 2/3 numbers 2 days before the next election of people doubting that their vote counts.
Who are you getting pressure from for immediate action?
Everyone.
Everyone, I mean, are these politicians? Are these constituents? Or who are these people?
Yes.
All of the above. Have you heard from Democrats who want this?
I have not yet, but I was just sketching out the last couple of days. I am going to reach out to whoever will talk with me. And I believe that I firmly believe that this is not a partisan issue, that everybody should be interested in making sure that going forward, our voting and ballot system is transparent and honest, and equally as important in a democratic society, has the appearance of transparency and honesty.
So the last thing I want to get to is just to kind of talk about some other investigations that are going on. So Wisconsin election officials have identified 27 cases of potential voter fraud out of 3.3 million ballots and sent them to local district attorneys for possible prosecution. 2 people have been charged with election fraud. A Wisconsin man who cast 2 absentee ballots was charged with 4 felonies. Not to mention the Legislative Audit Bureau, they're doing their own investigation. So doesn't that improve that fraud detection is going on here? Why does there need to be more?
Yeah, I agree. As I indicated at the top of the interview, right now I'm looking at 3 broad categories of publicly reported concerns.
But is there evidence besides people saying they're concerned after having a president who told them to be concerned? Is there evidence for concern?
Well, I believe that there's enough to warrant a very thorough examination, and especially so because if a significant percentage, and a majority at that, a 2/3 majority of our fellow citizens, our neighbors, do not have confidence in our electoral process, that's a fundamental problem for the future of our state and the future of our country. You brought up these other investigations that are going on, and yes, I do believe that there will be some overlap. And in order to make this the most efficient and financially responsible investigation from my part, I will try to learn from whoever is conducting those investigations things that, A, might be of assistance to my far more global responsibility. You said the Audit Bureau, and you made reference to some district attorneys. Well, that covers some numbers, and that covers potential criminal misconduct. Mine is a far more global mission to oversee, to overlook, to review and look over and examine every part of the procedural process of the November 2020 election with the intent so that at the end of my investigation, people can be assured either that everything was fine or that, hey, most things were fine, and the things that went wrong, here are my recommendations for improving them going forward.
Do you have all your investigator positions filled? We were hearing that maybe someone had quit. Was that true?
I know there have been different things reported in the public, and what I feel comfortable saying about that is in the press release that Speaker Vos released 2 days ago, just this past Friday, he did indicate that as special counsel, so he clarified that I am not a coordinating counsel, but I am in fact special counsel for the entire legislature, Democrats and Republicans. And that's one of the things that clarified the importance for me of reaching out to all members of all different parties to learn their insights and their opinions. And the other thing he clarified 2 days ago in his press release is that as special prosecutor, I will have sole discretion regarding the hiring, the direction, and the retention of investigators. So the identities of the investigators and the current job status is something I really don't feel would be helpful to my investigation to discuss, or frankly, helpful to the people involved. And I'm just going to say that going forward, I will be determining who the investigators are in this process. And I think a lot of it too, when the original investigators were hired, nobody realized what investigative resources were going to be necessary to carry out this mission.
All right, Justice Gableman, thank you.
Thank you.